January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The sound is not the roar of engines, but the whisper of snow. A biting wind scours the wreckage, polishing the steel of abandoned hulks to a brutal, frozen sheen. It is 3 hours before dawn, and the temperature has plummeted to 20 degrees below freezing. The only discernible sound in the silent pine forests, a forest that swallowed men and machines whole barely a month prior, is the unmistakable, almost delicate clink of thin metal. A GI, huddled in a foxhole carved from frozen earth near the road to Hofelice, flicks open a key on a small, rectangular can. The K-ration. The sound is utterly mundane, yet it is the sonic signature of the entire American effort, a promise of instantaneous, if unglamorous, sustenance. A world away from the ideological fervor of the enemy. Here was the quiet, metallic certainty of abundance. This tiny, functional tin, holding processed cheese, for cigarettes and a block of instant coffee, represents the antithesis of the machine that was now dying around it. It is the end of the greatest gamble of the Second World War, an offensive launched by the Wehrmacht on December 16, 1944, intended to tear the Western Front in half and force a negotiated peace. An operation defined by its tanks, but ultimately destroyed by logistics, by oil, and by this, the simple, mass-produced calorie, historical context, the winter illusion, and Hitler's final gamble to understand why this silence matters. We must return to the deceptive quiet of the previous autumn. By late 1944, the Western Allies believed the German army was a broken, retreating force. They had pushed through France, liberated Paris, and stood poised on the Rhine. Their lines, though stretched, seemed secure. They chose the Ardennes, a rugged, heavily forested region that had historically favored the defender, as a resting place for recovering divisions and green troops. It was the Ghost Front, a sector where the Allied High Command, weary from the summer campaigns, judged that no significant military movement could possibly occur. This was the first great miscalculation. The Allied command, blinded by the speed of their summer advance and the certainty of victory, had convinced themselves that the Wehrmacht lacked the resources, the manpower, and the sheer nerve for a grand counterstroke. This complacency was born of success, but it was also a failure to comprehend the nihilistic, cornered desperation of the Nazi regime. For Adolf Hitler, this was the last viable move. His regime, reeling from the colossal losses on the Eastern Front and the relentless Allied strategic bombing, faced extinction. The German industrial base was sputtering, oil reserves were dangerously low, and the Volkssturm, conscripts and boys, were filling the ranks. Yet, the Führer held an almost religious faith in the power of the offensive, the principle of the surprise attack, and the theoretical superiority of German engineering. His goal was not merely to stop the Allies, but to replicate the 1940 Blitzkrieg, seizing the critical port of Antwerp and trapping for Allied armies. The ultimate tool for this impossible task would be the Panzer Arm, reconstituted, refitted, and armed with the most formidable heavy tanks ever produced. The operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was a massive act of denial. It committed 29 divisions, including 10 of the best remaining Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions. It was a spearhead of heavy steel, the dreaded Tiger II, Königstiger, the lethal Panther, and the dependable Panzer IV. This was the German Grossraumwertschaft, the planned greater economic area, concentrated into a single, deadly, and utterly unsustainable thrust. The sheer scale of the preparation, hidden by meticulous deception and the persistent low clouds of the European winter, represents one of the most remarkable acts of strategic surprise in military history. The overcast sky, which grounded the overwhelming power of the Allied air forces, was seen by the German commanders not as a weather phenomenon, but as an act of divine, ideological favor. It bought them the essential element of surprise, which their failing industrial machine could no longer provide through sheer mass. Emotional contrast. Expectations versus reality on the front line in the cold, damp assembly areas behind the lines. The German tanker, the Panzerschütze, felt a surge of familiar, terrifying confidence. For 4 long years, German armor had been synonymous with victory, with swift, decisive movement. The ideology of the Reich was literally built into the thick, sloped armor of the Panther. They had been taught, and had often proven, that a single Panther could engage 4, 5, or even 6 American M4 Shermans and survive. They had the technical advantage, the qualitative edge, and a burning, desperate belief in the invincibility of their heavy steel. Their expectation was a return to the glorious past, a rapid thrust, panicked American withdrawal, and the psychological collapse of a force they perceived as soft, wealthy, and poorly led. They saw the American soldier as an amateur, armed with a mass-produced, geometrically simple tank that was dangerously prone to catching fire, the infamous Ronson nickname. The war, for them, was a contest of technical will, and the immense weight of their steel seemed to guarantee success. They saw their tanks, particularly the Tiger II, as instruments of destiny, the ultimate expression of Aryan industrial supremacy. They were ready to deliver the final, crushing blow. They expected to drive until they saw the North Sea, replenished by captured American gasoline and stores. Then came the reality. The first days were brutal. The shock was complete. As Kampfgruppe Paper's armored spearhead carved its way through the snow-choked valleys toward the Meuse, they encountered the scattered, desperate resistance of American infantry and artillery. But quickly, the reality of the American war effort began to assert itself, not in the form of superior individual tanks, but in the terrifying, inexhaustible depth of the American logistical commitment. Paper's troops, exhausted from the initial advance and the frantic close-quarters battles in villages like Stavelot and Stomont, began to experience an utterly alien realization. The deeper they drove, the more supplies the Americans had. When a German tank was knocked out, the crew was gone and often irreplaceable. When an American Sherman was destroyed, another one, just as new and just as fully fueled and manned, seemed to materialize from the thick forests behind it. The German soldier found himself engaged in a war of attrition where the army simply had more of everything. The emotional contrast was stark. The German soldier, fighting for the survival of a starving, blockaded empire, relied on scavenged fuel and the dwindling contents of his Marschverpflegung, March rations. He fought with the gnawing certainty that every shell fired, every liter of fuel burned, was irreplaceable, a piece of the shrinking Reich. The American soldier, however, was fighting with the quiet assurance that, whatever the tactical setback, whatever the freezing, immediate loss, the immense industrial weight of the United States was relentlessly driving forward to back him up. This assurance was literally packaged in the K-ration tin. The German soldier might eat a meager crust of black bread and ersatz coffee. The American was guaranteed his fruit bar, his tinned meat, and his 4 cigarettes, an endless, steady stream of processed, high-calorie, mass-produced energy. The clink of the opening tin, heard now in captured German foxholes, was the sound of a logistics system that mocked the entire concept of a material shortage. It was the sound of a democratic economy functioning perfectly, delivering sustenance to the man at the farthest point of the supply line. Historical evidence. The numbers game and the Sherman's reliability. The tank battle of the Bulge was less about individual duels and more about mathematical inevitability. Factual records bear this out in horrifying detail. The core of the conflict was not metallurgy, but mathematics. In the initial assault, the Germans committed approximately 970 operational tanks and assault guns. This was a formidable force, but it was a fixed number. The vast majority of the heavy Panthers and Tiger IIs could not be easily repaired or replaced once lost in the field. Every kilometer of advance put them farther from their supply depots and closer to the breaking point. The German supply of 75mm and 88mm shells, while sufficient for the initial push, was finite, and the logistics tail was brittle, relying almost entirely on road transport that was quickly snarled by congestion and poor weather. The Americans, by contrast, had a vast pool of armor, not only in the immediate vicinity, but rolling in from the rear. The workhorse, the M4 Sherman, had its flaws, its high profile, its initial 75mm gun's inadequacy against the Panther's sloped armor, and its tendency to brew up when hit. But the M4 possessed qualities the German tanks lacked: simplicity, reliability, and ubiquity. The M4 used a radial aircraft engine, simple to maintain and requiring far less specialized fuel than the high-compression German diesel and gasoline engines. The American tank was designed for mass production, with standardized parts that could be swapped out in a matter of hours. The production figures tell the definitive story of the war. The Germans manufactured roughly 6,000 Panthers and just under 1,400 Tigers, both variants, throughout the entire war. The United States produced nearly 50,000 M4 Shermans, a difference in scale that completely overwhelms any qualitative advantage. The difference was a factor of 8-to-1 in total production, and in the Ardennes, it meant that the Americans could afford losses the Germans could not. The early footage captured by Signal Corps photographers, often showing burning Shermans and disoriented infantry, tells the story of the tactical defeat. But the later footage, the sheer volume of traffic filmed pouring into the rear area, tells the story of the strategic victory. The roads leading out of France were suddenly choked with a seemingly infinite stream of trucks, half-tracks, and tanks. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, and it was the nervous system of the Allied logistical body. A marvel of civilian truck drivers and military engineers working 24 hours a day to push the mountain of supply forward. Consider the consumption. A German Tiger II, with its immense weight and demanding engine, consumed fuel at a rate that meant its operational range was severely limited, often less than 120 miles on a full tank, even under perfect conditions. In the snow and mud of the Ardennes, that range was halved, and the necessary high-octane fuel was simply unavailable in the required volume. By contrast, the American logistical system could project fuel and ammunition forward faster than the German tanks could burn it. The American doctrine, unlike the German one, correctly assumed that tanks would need to be resupplied continuously, not just at the final objective. The pivot point was not a tank duel, but a maneuver. General Patton's Third Army turning 90 degrees in the middle of a major offensive and driving 150 miles north in 3 days to relieve Bastogne. It was a feat of mechanical logistics unprecedented in military history. The thousands of men, tanks, and trucks that accomplished this were not motivated by ideological zeal, but by the relentless efficiency of the industrial, democratic machine. It was a triumph of the motor pool and the quartermaster corps. A silent victory before the first gun was fired, the symbolism of abundance. The K-ration as ideological marker, our symbolic object. The K-ration was a complete microcosm of this industrial power. Designed to sustain a soldier for a single, high-activity day, it was the result of massive pre-packaging and food science. It was universally available, standardized, and most importantly, endlessly replaceable. It was the material promise of American life, delivered directly to the mud and snow of the European battlefield. The German soldier, if captured, would often stare in disbelief at the contents. The German reality was defined by ersatz products, coffee substitutes, synthetic oils, recycled materials. The German economy, having prioritized war production over consumer goods for over a decade, was utterly incapable of providing this level of comfort or complexity to the man at the front. The K-ration contained real American commodities: tinned Spam, chewing gum, instant coffee, and chocolate. It was a taste of a world the German soldier had been told was decadent and weak, but which could, paradoxically, produce and project endless material strength. The recurring motif is the sound and feel of the ration. The metallic, reassuring clink as the key tears open the can. The crinkle of the waterproof cigarette pack. The gritty, manufactured taste of the block of high-energy chocolate. This was not the fuel of fanaticism. It was the fuel of a society so abundant that it could outfit a single infantryman with a pre-packaged, 3-course meal that was better than what many German civilians were eating back home. This small, rectangular tin was, in its own way, a weapon of psychological warfare. It was the physical manifestation of the boundless American rear, a resource that the Wehrmacht, for all its superior tanks, simply could not match or comprehend. The K-ration was the smallest unit of American industrial power, and it was everywhere. Transformation, the American response, and the M36 Jackson, the early days of the offensive, brought a painful, necessary transformation to American perception. The initial losses were a profound shock. The 75 mm and even the newer 76mm guns on the standard Sherman often failed to penetrate the thick frontal armor of the Panther at effective combat ranges. This technological asymmetry forced the American military to rapidly adapt and accelerate the deployment of its dedicated counterweapons. This period of shock gave way to furious, practical innovation. The transformation was spearheaded by the tank destroyers, mobile, powerful guns on lightly armored chassis. The most effective weapon to enter the fray was the M36 Jackson. Its massive 90mm cannon was capable of piercing the frontal plate of a Panther and even the formidable side armor of a Tiger II. This shift was a realization. The American doctrine was not to build a single tank superior to the German heavy armor, but to build a system that could overwhelm it. They fought with a multi-layered approach, the Sherman for general support, the tank destroyer for dedicated anti-armor roles, and air power, once the clouds cleared, for swift tactical intervention. The doctrine stated that tanks were for exploitation, and tank destroyers were for killing tanks. The Ardennes forced the realization that this distinction was becoming blurred and that massed armor, even if qualitatively inferior, could only be stopped by a quantitative application of superior firepower. The American response was pragmatic. Use what you have, and when that fails, build a better gun and mount it on a simple chassis. This expediency was the essence of the democratic industrial model. The battle transformed the American soldier's self-perception. The Green troops, initially shattered by the surprise and the ruthlessness of the German attack, learned the hard lessons of winter combat and combined arms. The defensive stands at Bastogne, St. Vith, and Elsenborn Ridge were not victories of engineering, but of human resilience, stubbornness, and the implicit trust in that relentless logistical support. The defenders were not primarily armored divisions, but infantry and paratroopers who were resupplied by air and who, despite the cold and the encirclement, continued to receive their daily K-rations. The famous response of General McAuliffe to the German demand for surrender at Bastogne, nuts, was more than simple defiance. It was the confidence of a commander who knew that despite being surrounded, his troops were eating their K-rations, had been airdropped ammunition, and that the entire weight of the American war effort was turning to break the ring. He knew that the perimeter, however ragged, would hold because the support structure of the American democracy, vast and slow-moving, was turning the entire world to their aid. The German commander, by contrast, was bluffing, fighting with tanks that were already running on fumes and men who had not eaten a hot meal in days. The climax, the reality of the fuel gauge, the fate of the battle was sealed not by the guns of the M36 Jackson, but by the lack of gasoline. The primary, catastrophic failure of the German plan was the reliance on capturing Allied fuel depots. They knew their own supply chain was too brittle to support the required penetration depth of over 100 miles. When Paper's spearhead was stopped near Stillmont and Stavelot, not by superior armor, but by relentless infantry resistance and the tactical destruction of fuel dumps, the entire operation began to unravel. The cinematic footage recovered from the last week of December and early January is telling. It shows not triumphant advance, but abandoned machines. The image of a Tiger II, the pinnacle of German engineering, sitting silently, perfectly intact, on a snow-covered road near Stavelot, its gun pointing uselessly, is the true portrait of the German defeat. The most powerful tank in the world, rendered inert by an empty fuel tank. Ideology defeated by physics. German documents confirm the desperate state. Tank commanders were ordered to strip fuel from civilian vehicles and even from their own supply trucks, paralyzing the rear areas simply to keep the lead tanks moving. But the arithmetic was inescapable. The American logistical line, symbolized by the constant, grinding, four-lane traffic of the Red Ball Express, delivered exponentially more gallons of gasoline per hour than the German rail and truck lines could manage, and certainly more than the Americans were willing to surrender. The Americans, pushing back, began to find these steel behemoths scattered across the salient. They were the ghosts of the offensive, testimony to the German qualitative edge, but also to its fatal flaw. A Panther tank could dominate the battlefield, but only if it had fuel. The M4 Sherman, with its less glamorous power, was still moving because the supply line, that unending, clanking chain of trucks and rail cars, had never stopped. The German command could build the perfect weapon. The American command could fuel the imperfect one indefinitely. The German soldiers' transformation was one of disillusionment. Their faith in the blitzkrieg died in the freezing Ardennes air. They realized that their technological superiority was meaningless against infinite resource projection. They recognized that the complexity of their tanks, which required highly trained mechanics and specialized parts, was a handicap when compared to the simple, standardized, easily repaired American M4. They were defeated not by the better machine, but by the better system. Their war was artisanal, their enemy's was industrial. Transformation of ideology. Democracy's unseen weapon. The War of the Tanks in the Ardennes was an ideological clash fought on tracks and armor plating. The German vision was one of hierarchical, centralized control, where quality was achieved through complexity and precision, the ideal of the master craftsman. The Tiger II was a masterpiece of specialized engineering, requiring thousands of man-hours and highly skilled labor. It was an ideological tank, built on the premise that one superior tank could replace several inferior ones. This required a centralized, top-down decision-making process that was slow to adapt and prone to catastrophic failure. The American vision was the product of a decentralized, democratic economy, mass production, redundancy, and reliability. The Sherman was a pragmatic, common-sense vehicle, built with speed and standardization as its guiding principles. It was a tank built by workers who were well-fed, often on the same components found in the K-ration, and who were building machines to defend their own way of life. The abundance of the K-ration and the abundance of the Sherman are two sides of the same coin. The American industrial base. This abundance was not merely a matter of material wealth. It was an ideological statement. It showed that a free society, with its immense productive capacity, could outproduce any totalitarian state relying on slave labor and centralized, brittle planning. The American soldier, watching the relief columns arrive, understood the true scale of their war effort. They were not just fighting a battle. They were the point of the spear of an entire, functioning continental economy. They were the beneficiaries of an industrial complex that had converted car factories into tank assembly lines almost overnight. The Germans were fighting to survive. The Americans were fighting to win, with the implicit knowledge that their resources were endless and their capacity for replacement was absolute. The tank battle, captured now in grainy, cold footage, reveals this fundamental truth. The German armored division was a finely sharpened scalpel, precise, deadly, but fragile. The American armored column, with its hundreds of Shermans and thousands of support vehicles, was a vast, unyielding wave, less precise, but absolutely unstoppable. When the scalpel broke, there was no replacement. When the wave lost a drop, the sea of production simply provided another. The experience in the Ardennes permanently altered the perception of war for both sides. The German Panzerschutz had his faith in German technological superiority shattered. The American GI gained a quiet, absolute confidence in the massive weight of his country's industrial might. The qualitative loss in tank-on-tank duels was utterly negated by the quantitative, relentless surge of American replacement. The battle was won in the factories of Detroit and the supply depots of France, long before the tanks engaged. Epilogue. The clink of finality. The final scene returns to the silence of the Ardennes, weeks after the German lines have collapsed and the salient has been erased. The camera pans across the wreckage, a shattered Panther turret here, a discarded German helmet there. The freezing air has settled, replaced by the faint, earthy smell of pine and thawing mud. The silence is broken once more. That metallic sound, a faint, distant clink. Is the sound of an American field engineer dismantling a temporary bridge, or a medic packing away an empty supply crate, or perhaps one last GI opening the last of his personal rations before the advance continues into Germany. The sound is functional, unromantic, yet deeply profound. The great tank battle of the Ardennes, fought with the most powerful armored machines of the era, was not decided by the thickness of a tiger's armor or the speed of a panther's traverse. It was decided, ultimately, by the humble, unwavering efficiency of logistics. It was decided by oil, by tires, by standardized parts, and by the caloric intake of the common soldier. The logistical supply line was the true weapon of mass destruction. The K-ration tin, simple, rectangular, mass-produced, was the true symbolic weapon. It represented the ultimate, undeniable truth of the American experience, the immense, terrifying power of abundance, harnessed and projected across an ocean and a continent. The tin proved that the true strength of democracy was not its rhetoric, but its capacity to organize and deliver simple, dependable material reality to every man on the line. Consistently, and without fail, the war in the West was, in the end, a referendum on two systems, one built on scarcity, dogma, and finite precision, the other built on freedom, ingenuity, and infinite production. In the frozen forests of Belgium, where the ideological certainty of the Panzer arm dissolved into the physical certainty of an empty fuel gauge, the metallic clink of the American ration tin became the sound of finality. It was the quiet, confident sound of a democracy that could feed its armies forever, and in doing so, could move the world. The lesson remains etched in the rusting steel of the bulge. True military power is not just the quality of the first shot fired, but the quality of the endless sustenance that follows. This is the enduring truth the camera captured, not the spectacle of destruction, but the monotonous, undeniable reality of supply. Freedom, it turns out, is highly mechanized, deeply provisioned, and comes in a small, rectangular tin.